Hey guys, it's Gary. Decided to do another video after only a couple days of laying off. Cheers. For those of you keeping track, I mentioned how I haven't had any coffee, just about any coffee. I think I had maybe 2 cups of instant coffee, not something I'm a fan of, since I left work back in March. I've avoided coffee, and in my entire adult life, I've never had a coffee machine at home, and that is because I was always hooked enough at work, and on weekends and days I was off, I would give my body a break from caffeine, because at one point I was drinking about 12 cups a day. Well, a good buddy of mine that I used to work with, who was the main coffeeholic like I was, left the job that I was working at about 7 years or so ago. And when he left, I consciously cut down on coffee a bit. My hands were shaking all the time and everything. And that was even without coffee on the weekends. That was just the pure amount that I was having on my Monday through Friday job. So I never touched it on weekends, unless I went out to a diner. Then I had to have some diner coffee. But when he left, I went to, I still had a friend that was in our little coffee clutch, but she had cut down herself to 2 cups a day. So I kind of followed her lead, got myself down to 2 cups a day, unless I was having a particularly rough day. I would have my 2 cups with her, and then possibly make another one for myself, if I was having a bad day or didn't get enough sleep the night before or something like that. But I've missed my coffee now that I'm unemployed. And as I mentioned in one of my previous videos recently, I got a coffee maker for $8. You look at the box and it looks like a full-size coffee maker. It's a Mr. Coffee. Well, I was still hesitant to hook it up. Put it on a shelf in my garage. It didn't last there long, about a week. Last night I went out and I took it off the shelf in the garage and prepared it. I didn't have any counter space for it, so today I spent hours cleaning and moving things and putting things away so I could make enough counter space for the thing. Hooked it up and realized that the little decanter thing is only about that big. They consider it 4 cups, but it's not 4 cups, it's more like 2, which is great for a single person. I thought it was a full-size pot. So it's a little size, and it's good. It means the coffee maker's smaller, the pot's small, like that. Perfect. I hooked it up naturally without reading the instructions, and something went wrong, and I attempted to make my first pot, and all the water's inside in the filter basket, but none of it was dripping through to the coffee maker. I flipped open the top, and the basket with the coffee, and it's all full of water, and now it's spilling out all over the inside of the coffee machine, onto my counter and everything, because I hadn't placed everything in the right position. But that didn't deter me. You think that would send me a message saying maybe you shouldn't be having coffee at home. I proceeded to pull out the book to see what I was doing wrong, and figured out exactly how it worked, and made my first real pot of coffee after throwing out the other coffee grinds and cleaning everything up. And now the end result is my first cup of coffee since I moved here almost 3 years ago, 2 years and 9 months ago. So my first cup of coffee in my place. First cup of coffee anywhere in home. Well, I don't think I've ever had coffee at home. I've had coffee over my sister's place. I really didn't drink much coffee when I was like a kid growing up that my parents would have made. Now I'm hooked. And the place smells wonderful because it's vanilla flavored. I thought it would make me all uppity and jittery, and it's past 6:30 p.m. I've been having terrible trouble trying to get to sleep, and the last few nights I haven't been able to get to sleep till 2:30 or 3 in the morning. Why would I be drinking coffee? But you know what? Oddly enough, it's not doing it. It's not making me very much more awake or alert, and certainly not jittery. So that's my report for the day. I've been a little while ago. I'm working on an album, and I've got one thing for acoustic and classical guitars, and I've got the basic layered tracks down, and because everything on the album is so electronic, I wanted to have something acoustic on there. I'm having trouble with the lead guitars and the solo guitars, and I'm going to be working on that, but I'm waiting for some. I'm still learning and finding things that I left behind in my old place, which was sold and demolished. Albums. One of the albums I went looking for today to do this video, I haven't been able to find on vinyl, and I know I had it. Thankfully, I have it on CD, but I'm a little upset to think that I might have actually left one of my ECM vinyls behind. I can't find it, and I don't have that many places here that I have my vinyl albums stored. And I put all my ECMs together, and I can't find it. Thankfully, I have it on CD, and I'll be showing that in a little while. But I decided to just pick up my classical guitar, my nylon string guitar, and just improvise for about 5 or 6 minutes, which I did, and I recorded it. And it's got a couple mistakes which I can actually edit out, thanks to the fact that I'm now recording for the first time ever in my life using software, using recording software. I'm very bad with computer programs. And Pro Tools, too complex. I would never be able to master that for sure. But, while I'm recording, and this is another one-man band project thing, whatever you want to call it, has gotten me to thinking. And I've gone off about this. I think any album that I showed today I've already showed. But it kind of got me thinking about, I've mentioned this before, my favorite setting for a musical album is one-man solo projects. Not especially live things, like, for instance, a lot of Keith Jarrett solo albums that are essentially live, whether it's piano or sometimes organ. I don't mean, and there's a lot of classical albums that are solo piano or solo classical guitar albums. I don't mean those albums so much in the live solo mode. I like those as well. But my primary interest, the thing that really piques my interest in an artist, and probably the first thing I would go to if I don't have any albums by an artist, and I were to find an album like this, which would be an album where one musician pretty much plays all the parts and pieces himself, a real true solo album, not live in the studio, but a real solo album where they use overdubbing and such things. And I was just thinking about it when I was preparing for this, and I was thinking, well, what's the first one that I ever heard? And I may or may not have heard some Les Paul instrumentals. Probably not when I was a kid. Les Paul was infamous for doing that, mostly with his wife Mary Ford. Les Paul, by the way, lived his last 40 or 50 years in the very town that I live in, up until when he died in 2009. He lived in the town that I live in now. And his famous hit singles on radio had his wife singing and overdubbing her voice as well. Though, at the same time, he also recorded a lot of his own instrumentals. And I believe were primarily him playing solo through overdubbing. I don't really think I heard too many of those as a kid growing up. And I was thinking that some of the albums I was going to show today may have been the first albums where I ever heard that, and it just dawned on me that actually the very first album that I ever heard one musician overdub and play all the parts himself was when I was about 10 years old, 10 or 11. Paul McCartney's first solo album after the Beatles, just called McCartney, had Maybe I'm Amazed on it, which is not a favorite track of mine. but it actually had a couple instrumental tracks on there, a whole bunch of vocal songs. I didn't understand the concept. That I remember having the Gatefold album as a kid, and to this day, it's still my favorite thing Paul McCartney's ever done. That includes the Beatles. And I really, even as a kid, I got into the instrumentals, and the vocal songs and all that. And I remember reading inside the Gatefold, it said, I don't think, at that point, his wife Linda was not performing yet. I don't believe she does anything on the album. I know she doesn't play any keyboards on the album. I don't think she even sings any backup vocals on the album. I could be wrong, but I don't think so. I don't think it was until he formed Wings, or a couple solo albums down the pike, that she started contributing to his albums. His first solo album was all him, and I remember reading all instruments played by Paul McCartney on the inside, and I didn't understand the concept as a little kid of overdubbing. So I'm like, how is that possible? I'm hearing drums and keyboards, and I actually pictured him with two cymbals strapped to his knees facing in toward each other, and him banging his legs together to get the cymbal sounds while he played keyboards and guitar, because I could make out only instruments. I could hear, well, there's keyboards, there's guitar, there's bass, there's drums. How can somebody do this all at once? Not understanding the concept at 10 years old or 11 years old of overdubbing. But that was probably the first time that I heard that, and I love that concept, that whole idea of one musician doing everything. It means that there's no notes on here that he didn't come up with himself, no ideas or compositions, or, well, not compositions, but solos or notes or inflections of a note, which are also very important. And I always like that concept, because with more than one musician, a lot of that is given over to that second or third or fourth person, even if the guy's pleased with the results. I just like that whole concept of every single note, every concept for all of the music and all of the playing on the album came from this one person. And I love that concept right off the bat, even though for those years I kind of forgot about the McCartney album after a few years. And as I was getting, after a number of years, by the time I was, I don't know, about 17 or so, 17, 18, when I was looking past prog rock, which was the step that I was at maybe at that age, looking toward other more creative forms of music or something, and flipping through the bins and reading album credits, which I always did, and I was ready for something different outside of the rock world. I think everything I'm showing today I've already shown before. This was one of the first ones, and this just so happened to be my first Klaus Schulze album. And it's a tie for first place with my favorite Klaus Schulze album to this day. So I got this in 78 or 79. When I opened it, I clearly saw that the music sounded like the pictures. It really does. Read on the back that, basically all of the, I just love the concept, and I probably looked at this for a few trips to the record store before I actually bought it. It was obvious from the back cover credits that Klaus Schulze was a keyboard player, was a synthesizer player. It actually lists all of the keyboards he plays on here. And back then, synthesizers didn't have hundreds of sounds programmed in. A string ensemble, which was a type of keyboard I actually had one of, it was my first synthesizer, is a type of keyboard. It only got one sound. The ARP Odyssey that he's got listed here, and Moogs and things like that, did get more than one sound. They were monophonic, though. They played one note at a time. So there's an organ on here, a couple different organs that he uses, a Farfisa piano, but there's no piano sounds really that you hear on Time Wind, which was his fifth album. But I got hooked by the cover, but I really specifically wanted something that had no one else on it, just one person. This was clear it was overdubbing with the number of keyboards, like 8 or so different keyboards on here. And it really, oddly enough, there's just 2 long pieces on here, each about 30 minutes. It sounded like I hoped it would sound. It doesn't sound like a band, and that's a big differentiation for me. Unlike the McCartney album, which actually did sound like a band, there was drums and keyboards and bass and vocals. Actually sounded like it could have been a whole band playing. I like the concept in these one-man singular albums, even with the overdubs, the instruments being overdubbed, that it's not trying to sound like a band. That's not the idea. And this was very important to me in my conceptual development of music, and not just in my work, but in the concept of what music could be. And that is, not everybody wants to sound like a band. You could do it like Paul McCartney did, and just lay down a bass and drums and keyboards and guitars. And unless somebody read the credits, would not know that it's not a full band playing. Or you can do this kind of thing, or like a lot of the other albums that I'm going to show. And even though there's a lot going on instrumentally, and there's a lot of instruments going on, it's not a live performance. It's not intended to sound like a band. It's intended to sound like what exactly it sounds like. And that could be a lot of space, a little space, no space. But it's a different way of listening to music than most albums offer, regardless of what type of music you're into, reggae or oldies or 50s music or doo-wop or whatever the hell you're into, except for maybe classical music. And that is, everything kind of sounds like it's performed by a group of various sizes. The concept behind these albums that I love so much are not to sound like a band necessarily, but to sound like this musical world that this person's creating, not in place of a band, instead of a band. So, when I got this, I love the album, but I also love the concept. And I'm going to show some of the albums that were very influential in terms of me getting and understanding that concept. They're not necessarily my favorite albums by the artists. I will point out when they are. But they're the ones that were most important to me, that I purchased early in my discovery of there's more than one way of listening to music. And I guess when you come out of a rock or rap or any kind of popular music idiom, even jazz, say, and you go into classical music, if you listen to any classical music or even extremely avant-garde music at all, you realize you can't listen to it the same way you listen to pop music. So there's an adjustment made. And there's a way to listen to it, maybe different aspects of it that you listen to. Again, it's different than just a live performance on a single instrument, like a Keith Jarrett piano thing or something like that. I'm really focused on the concept of one musician doing everything and overdubbing a great deal, but not just a solo instrument feature, So I got heavily into Time Wind by Klaus Schulze, and I went, reading the backs of other albums when I could, when there was information there to discover. I don't know the order I bought this in, but I know this is a very early purchase. Again, Mirage by Klaus Schulze, another all-solo album. No other musicians on here. He's got a whole instrument list on the inside of the booklet. Another 2 long songs, almost 30 minutes aside here. This is another real good one. I put probably in his top 5 or so. And another, very similar in direction, but I just like the concept. Again, all electronic keyboards. And this one is also, this is my tie for first place, Airlicht, which is his first solo album. You could say he cheats a little bit here because he did take a recording of an orchestra, a string orchestra, and he kind of reverses it and puts it backwards and treats it, but it's not a major part of the piece. It's just kind of in with all the avant-garde rumblings going on. And his first two albums were very different, especially. But again, this really was a solo, and this is a solo album, and this is no synthesizer. Actually, this is all done on organ. This is very avant-garde, though. Not only do I love the cover, I love the inside cover, which could have been a cover on itself, the ice. Love that picture. Love that picture. Great package. And in the case of Klaus, I would say these are easily Time Wind and Irrelict are definitely in a tie for first place. Mirage is definitely, the previous one I showed is definitely in my top 5 of his. And these are all solo albums, as I said, with that one exception of Klaus playing around with some tapes of an orchestral string section. Another early one, just a little bit before my discovery of kind of the creative end of jazz and ECM records, though, was what's playing in the background. And I don't know to what extent you can hear it. Sometimes the music sounds so loud to me here, and nothing comes out in the audio. And then other times it's fairly loud. And this is a guy I knew nothing about minimalism. I knew nothing about Terry Riley. Didn't even think he was American. This is a French import. I knew more about. I realized that this claims right in the cover that it's a movie soundtrack, and I recognized Klaus Kinski, the actor. Like I said, not enough reason to buy the album, but I probably knew more about Klaus Kinski than I did about Terry Riley. Didn't know that he was considered, a serious composer. Didn't know, that he was part of the minimalism school, or really knew next to nothing at that time about the minimalism school. This is 77 or 78 that I got this. I got 78 because I think that's when it came out. I just had a feeling looking at the back of it that, it's got one of those huge, I believe it's a Hammond, but one of those dual keyboard organs, which I love, with all the drawbars on it and everything. You get different sounds. Still, this is my favorite organ album of all time because of the sounds he gets out of the organ. Some of this may be live, but if you know a bit about Terry Riley's history of playing live and coming up with really one of the first digital delay systems before they really existed, he found a way to play a repeating phrase on the keyboard and record it and loop it live, which is incredible to me, and then play over it. So there may be some tracks here which are done in that fashion, but there are others which clearly overdubbed because there's tabla playing on it. So there's no other musicians credited. I'm fairly sure that it's Terry Riley playing the tabla drums and then playing the organ parts over it. There's some voice on here, and there's saxophone, which I'm sure is played by Terry because he also plays saxophone. It's a beautiful saxophone in a couple of instances here. And this is another album I was absolutely floored by, maybe even more than the Klaus Schulze things. Loved this album, knew nothing about him. It was a French import. The internet wasn't around then to go do a search on what's this guy all about. You can do that in 5 minutes now. And I thought he was a European guy. Didn't know anything about him. Eventually started picking up other albums of his, but took me a few years to really realize who he was in terms of, he's an American, he's a composer, he's considered a serious artist, and still, oddly enough, my first purchase of a Terry Riley album ever. I've since added dozens of albums of his, but this is still my favorite. Beautiful album, very easy to get into too. Beautiful, fantastic album, and as it turns out, fairly rare. I mean, in this form, in this vinyl form. I kept on waiting for this to come out on CD. Thankfully, it finally did come out on CD about 5 or 6 years ago. I couldn't snatch up a copy fast enough. I'm actually tempted to just buy like 100 copies to make sure I'm never without it, because this is something that I would be surprised that it probably won't stay in print forever. It's not going to sell 1 million copies for the record company. But it was paired with another soundtrack that he did at about the same time, which is the other soundtrack is 2 18-minute long pieces. And that soundtrack, oddly enough, I discovered about a year before it was reissued on CD with the two albums together. And I spent a small fortune to get that soundtrack because I'm like, wow, I never even knew this album existed. Bought it, liked it, not as much as this, but, a very similar vibe maybe, with two extended keyboard, mostly organ instrumentals. Bought it, and about a year later, sure enough, that soundtrack came out on CD on a double with this one. This is only about a 30-minute album. I've recorded this album, in the years prior to... Actually, when I got a computer and was able to record LPs into my computer and burn them onto CDs, to spare the vinyl albums, because, at that point, this hadn't been released on vinyl. This is the first album I ever copied. That's how much I think of it. That's how much I love it. So it got me into a whole mindset of different ways of listening to music, outside of the band concept. And I loved then, and this was the late 70s, and I still love now, those one-man band type albums. When I discovered, jazz and ECM artists and the more European, especially the more European style of playing, I found out that a lot of those guys did albums. Here's maybe a bit of a cheat here, but Jack DeJohnette Pictures, which is easily among my favorite Jack DeJohnette albums. This is only a little bit of a cheat because it's 6 tracks. 3 tracks do have John Abercrombie on guitar, and 3 tracks are Jack DeJohnette totally on his own. The ones with John Abercrombie on guitar, maybe slightly more conventional and sounding like a duet, or like not really trying to sound like a band still at that point, but maybe slightly more conventional. I love duets also, by the way. So it's not like I don't like those tracks, because I do. But initially I was really focused, I guess, on the 3 tracks that Jack does totally on his own. One of them is a drum solo, actually, a very melodic drum solo, and that is live. But it's very interesting the way it's done, where Jack has his drums tuned so that he can actually play a melody on it. It's really beautiful. The other 2 tracks have much overdubbing. There's one with organ on it and percussion, another one with percussion and gongs and piano on it, very sparse. That one's called Picture Number 6, which is amongst my top 3 favorite Jack DeJohnette compositions. And I remember, this was recorded in February of 76, I think, yeah. And when I got it, oddly enough, was also in the dead of winter. And I remember making a tape copy and listening to it in the car. And I was sitting waiting to meet a friend or something like that one night, very in a parking lot, and it was very dark. And I had this on tape, and I was just sitting there listening to it. It was really cold. It may have been January or February. And I had just gotten the album and just couldn't get enough of it. Was listening to it a great deal. And just getting into the vibe, because it was unlike the prior albums I showed you by Klaus Schulze and Terry Riley, because there's a lot of keyboards on there, so the sound is very thick on those albums. This was more sparse. There was more sparseness to some of the solo tracks. Oddly, certainly the one that was just solo drums, and the very last one, Picture 6, which had based on a little piano, very sparse pattern, and some light percussion, but which oddly enough doesn't play a beat. It's more there for atmosphere. Really dug and still do dig this album. Not in any real order, but after discovering Jack DeJohnette and Bar Phillips was really the first ECM artist that I discovered, and from him I got into other people like Terje Ripdal, actually, which I discovered through Bar Phillips. Trilok Gurtu I discovered through Bar Phillips. And even though he only played 1 track on 1 album, I actually first heard John Abercrombie through Bar Phillips too. He played 1 improvised solo on his Mountainscapes album. And I said, I got to seek this guy out. And it turned out he recorded for the same label. And once again, John Abercrombie Characters, his only all-solo album. And this is my favorite album by his, by the way, and I've shown it probably several times now. Just John, his electric 6-string guitar, an acoustic 6-string guitar, and his little electric mandolin, overdubbed, and in some cases overdubbed a lot. But and there's actually more acoustic playing by John on here than any other album I've ever heard him play. And the mandolin really gives it a nice... It's hard to go for 45 minutes with only one instrument or a couple instruments, even overdubbed, and it not get boring or samey sounding, but John does a great job here. Each track has such a unique, unusual flavor to it. There's a few ballads sprinkled throughout, and all originals. And they're the shorter tracks on the album, and they're a little more conventional in terms of structures. An acoustic guitar is the base of it, with usually the electric mandolin or electric guitar, or even acoustic guitar playing a melody over it. But because they're spaced out and because they're shorter tracks, it doesn't get boring or samey sounding. Then there's 3 epics on here. One of them is very spacey sounding, using the volume swells on the electric guitar. Almost sounds like a keyboard. And the very first track, which is about 10.5 minutes, has so many guitar overdubs going on there. Oops. My second CD that was supposed to be playing stopped, didn't play. Hold on, guys, I'll be right back. I don't know why that does that sometimes. Sometimes when my CD player changes CDs, when one is done and the second one begins, for some reason it stops and the player tray opens up, and I don't know why it does that, because the CDs are situated in there correctly, and that's what happened. And I wanted to risk trying to play music in the background. And hopefully you can hear it, or else that was just a big waste. So I showed Characters. This is my favorite album of John's, and the only one like this he ever did. I did mention also, as a result of getting into Bar Phillips, that I discovered Terje Repdal, which is another guy that I got into as a result of Bar Phillips, and another guy that's actually, this is my favorite album of his as well, After the Rain. Again, his only all solo album. Now, his wife is credited with singing some voice on here, no lyrics, but just voice. But she's only on 2 tracks, and it took me years to really find where she was. She only sings some wordless vocals on 2 tracks, and oddly, it's where he plays the string synthesizer, and that's playing chords, and her voice is kind of mixed in with the chords to the extent that you can barely tell it's there. And honestly, if you took it out, I don't even know if you would notice the difference. Let me turn that down a little bit. I don't know if you would notice the difference. Like, it took me years to even find it. I like this album. It's quiet. It's like the album cover, which ECM was always very good at that. This must have been a tough album to record. A lot of shorter pieces on here that I wish were longer. I am totally unaware of another album that Terje Repdal plays any acoustic guitar on. He has 2 acoustic guitar tracks on here, both very short. One is just a live solo, and the second one is a duet for 2 acoustic guitars, which is really nice. He plays electric piano, acoustic piano, flute. He plays a little bit of saxophone, string synthesizer as well, and of course his signature electric guitar. The 1 or 2 longer pieces, actually on each side, are 6 minutes. The other things that are relatively long on here come closest to sounding maybe like some of the other work that he's done, but low key. There's no drums, there's no bass, there's no percussion at all. My favorite album is, and I think it's dated well because percussion tends to date a record. The 70s had very distinct, especially electric bass sounds, and the way the drums were recorded in the 70s and 80s. And sometimes date an album. Sometimes that's a fine, it's a good thing. I'm thinking of a lot of 1950s style jazz albums that you can tell because of the way they were recorded, and especially the drums, that they came from the 50s, but they sound great. But I think this one has aged well because of the lack of percussion and styles and grooves and grooves and percussion, drums and bass especially, a lot of times also, in addition to the way they're recorded and the sound, will give away. There's a lot of 60s and 70s grooves that you'll hear in rock music that weren't used after that. And as soon as you hear it, you know when that was recorded. This was recorded, actually, this album, in August of 76. But I think if you played it for somebody, anybody, it would be very hard for them to pick that out. Maybe the string synthesizer, if you know a lot about synthesizer technology and were there in the 70s and could pick out what a string synthesizer sounded like, that might aid you in determining when it was recorded. But it's such a fantastic, he even does a little flute solo on here. And my only complaint with it, which somebody else brought up too, I think it was Jeff Vinyl Spin, but I'm not sure. The only thing that prevents it from being a couple people's favorite albums is because I think it was Jeff who said he wants the tracks to go on longer. And I said, you know what, that's about the only criticism I could hurl at this album. Was, with the exception of the two 6-minute tracks, there's a lot of tracks, 2-3 minutes long, 4 at best. But just a fantastic thing to sit and analyze. And again, despite the fact that it's got keyboards and keyboard overdubs and guitars and guitar overdubs in some instances, it doesn't ever sound like a band. It's not intended to sound like a band. And it's a very interesting way of hearing music, especially without any kind of rhythm instruments. It kind of forces you to focus on something else besides a rhythm or a groove or a beat. And again, once again, this is my favorite album by the artist. This was it was a big revelation to me in terms of learning how to listen to music in a different way, and also conceptually, when it came time for me to record some of my own stuff, that I would rather attempt to occupy the same world, the same space, than I would be interested in doing a band thing or a band sounding thing. Keeping up with ECM, and this is going much longer than I wanted it to. Here's a great one. This is the first album where I did this. John Sermon, great saxophone player, ton of overdubs on this. Now, my favorite albums of John Sermon's are his solo albums where he does these, and he's got at least a half a dozen of these, all recorded for ECM. And I love it. This was his first from 79, I believe. Recorded May 79. Man, there's a lot of overdubs on here, but it's all wind instruments, and he does have an early monophonic synthesizer sequencer, which he uses on occasion, usually on the longer tracks, to play a repeating pattern, which I love very much, and then solo over it. But there's a lot of tracks without any synthesizer at all. And it's just all various soprano, baritone, saxophones, and bass clarinet. But it sounds like more than that. And he overdoes. Some of the tracks have a lot of saxophones on them. Very well thought out and written out things. Some of his other solo albums too have. The only albums that he really pretty much plays synthesizer on are his solo albums. When he's in a band context, the solo albums, he never seems to touch a synthesizer. But he's done quite a few of these, and he's played other instruments like the recorder, flute type of thing, which he does wonderfully as well on some of his other albums. He doesn't have any recorder on this, but this is a really good one. I love this album. Wouldn't necessarily say it's my favorite, but it's the first one he did like this, at least the first one I'm aware of, and the first one for ECM. But my go-to albums for John Surman, as good as he is in the band context, are always his solo albums. And after this, he, especially in the 80s and going into the 90s, he did quite a few for ECM. All of them are fantastic to me and worth listening to. And he did one a year or two ago. Again, after not having done a solo album for a while, and it was great as well. Here's one that's a bit harder to get into, but I love it, and that doesn't have anything to do with the artist. It's the instrument, acoustic upright bass. And again, it took a bit of adjusting. I was listening to solo stuff. I was listening to solo instruments, solo piano, solo classical guitar, and then these things that I prefer, which is the overdubbed multiple instrument things. But again, it took a little bit of adjustment to listen to. There's a couple tracks on here where there's overdubbing, which is great. I love the way Gary Peacock does it. I wish he would have done more of it, but he's never done another one of these. This was recorded in December, which is why it's called December Poems. And, more than half of the tracks are basically live upright bass. A little bit of a challenge to listen to. It's not meant to be a solo instrument. He's got a couple that he does overdubs with, and there are two tracks where Jan Garbarek does play saxophone on. So again, like the Jack DeJohnette thing, it's not a complete solo album, but the majority of it is a true solo album. And but it was very important for me. It was one that I really perked up and had to adjust and learn how to listen in a slightly different way. Once I kind of figured it out, I think it had a big effect on not only my listening, but how I perceived and wrote music. And sometimes after this point, I really began to appreciate albums that were a bit quieter and things that have a lot of acoustic space in them, thanks to Gary Peacock. I remember reading in Record Review magazine, which is a magazine that was around in the late 70s, and of course before the internet, your only way to learn about music was to read the music magazines. There's one called Record Review that reviewed everything, and it had a pop rock section at the time, had a jazz section, and had a classical section, and I think a world music section too. Great magazine. I would naturally go toward all the jazz stuff. After I read that, I would flip through and see if there's any record reviews of like rock artists that I used to listen to but didn't really anymore, just to keep current with them. And then when I got bored, I started going into the classical stuff and looking for interesting things, and even the world music stuff. But this is under jazz, one that I read about, and it was my first Egberto Gismonti album, just called Solo. And again, fantastic. This one maybe breaks the rules a little bit that I set up here, because a good deal of this is live. There's a couple tracks which are just solo live piano in the studio, and a couple long tracks that are acoustic guitars of various types, nylon string and steel string. But it has that sensitivity, and instead of sounding like a solo concert performance in the classical sense, or like maybe a lot of Keith Jarrett things would be, even though there really doesn't appear to be overdubbing on this, it works in the same way that the other overdubbed albums work. There's some voice that Egberto sings along with at times while he's playing guitar. He's got these things called cooking bells, which is them picture. I don't think they're really cooking bells. I think they're those. God, I have them and I forgot what you call them now. They're not Tibetan bowls. They're singing bowls is what they actually are, and each one is metallic, and you strike them with a striker and they ring out. A lot of times used for meditation. So he plays some of those, and when he plays those, I believe at one point he's singing over them. So it may or may not be a live. Most of it is a live performance, I think. but it has that sensibility. It doesn't sound like a live recital. It sounds more like the other albums where there's overdubs going on. And a lot of quiet moments, and I really appreciated this when I got this too. And because, to get back to my first ECM discovery, when I bought 3 Day Moon by Bar Phillips, and I got introduced to the musicians that played on that album and Bar Phillips' music, I became a Bar Phillips fanatic. Bought anything and everything I could find by him, which as a leader was almost nothing at that point. There was Mountainscapes and 3 Day Moon were the only two things I found with him as a leader in the record shops at the time. And then I found a catalog, a mail order catalog for this Bar Phillips Journal Violin album, which is solo bass again. Another learning experience in how to, I believe this was recorded in 69, 68 or 69. Can't find it on here now. November 68 it looks like. And again, mostly I think a live performance done in a church, but it has that sensibility of you have to really make an effort listening to this. There's a lot of extremely quiet moments. It's not avant-garde and screechy really, and it's a real experience if you can figure out a way to listen to it. And it's weird with these albums, especially the solo bass albums. I think if you find a way to listen to them, you inevitably end up loving them. But again, it's not meant to be a solo instrument, so it's a real challenge. And because there was so little available by him as a leader, I really sat down and forced myself and came out with a new appreciation of the act of playing of doing all of the music yourself. Another one that came out that I bought as soon as it came out, this was maybe a little bit later, well, October 79, it seems like 79 had a lot of these albums, and this was my first, I'm not sure if this was my first David Darling album or not. It may have been the Cycles album, which had a group of musicians on it. I remember the shop that I saw this in, and when I saw that it was David Darling all solo, this was the first time he did that. Journal October, recorded, did I say October 79, where he plays acoustic cello, he does some voice, he plays an 8-string electric cello, plays a little bit of percussion, not in a drum beat kind of way. There's some gongs and bells and things like that on there. But none of them playing a beat, really. They're more there for attention in the music. Fantastic album. And David Darling's a pretty fantastic guy, too. I got briefly to talk to him on one occasion after a concert. Nice guy. Great album, too. He's done a whole lot of solo albums after this. But this one is a little more avant-garde. Is actually a lot more avant-garde. He's done some that come very close to New Age music in terms of them being very pretty, and not necessarily for the ECM label. He has done others for ECM as well. This is definitely the one that is the most challenging, the most avant-garde at times. A lot of pretty stuff on here, but there's also kind of dark stuff on here as well. And this is definitely in my favorite albums of his, no doubt about it. A lot of stuff going on, a lot of overdubs on that one. Another artist that's done this on a few occasions. August 77, Dave Holland, Emerald Tears, the great upright bassist, this is pretty much a live thing. This is a live thing. Solo upright bass again. It's funny that, I love bassists, I love bassists and I love keyboard players. I don't know why I ended up playing guitar. But this is one that a lot of people have heard. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge to listen to it. And it's, again, when you figure out how to appreciate and listen to it, you almost invariably end up loving the music. Another one that he did a little bit later on, in 82, I think this was, November 82, that I really liked very much was Life Cycle, which is him entirely on cello. And this is, because it's cello and it's higher pitched, and he does do some overdubbing on this, it's a little bit easier to get into. This was really, I think, an overlooked album by his, considering it's on ECM, and he's done recording for labels outside of ECM. But this was another one that, a cello is not, I love the instrument, but it's not an instrument that I have a lot of recordings by. So again, I was tweaking my style of listening and the way I perceived music to really appreciate it, which eventually I did very much. I don't think I have that one on CD yet, and I'm not showing my favorite albums necessarily in this vein. I'm showing the ones that were fairly early purchases for me that were very influential to, like I said, to the way I perceived and listened to music, and also the way that when I started writing it too had a big effect on that. Another guy, and there's some overdubbing on this too. Bill Connors, who did this, was first one was 70. This is November '74. All acoustic, steel string, and nylon string guitars. Some of these tracks have overdubbing, others don't, so it's not a big full sound. And later on in August '79, this is my favorite of his in the solo realm, Swimming with a Hole in My Body, which this one comes closer a little bit to the John Abercrombie Characters album. Again, just steel string, no electric, and acoustic guitars. And this is probably the one I play the most of his. And there are a bunch of live tracks on there that don't appear to have overdubs, and then there's other that have overdubs on there. But again, a very interesting listening experience. And by the way, all these solo guitar albums, you would think that the one thing that a guitarist does to fill up the sound when he's playing solo, even with overdubs, is strum. None of these albums actually have the guitars strumming on the Abercrombie, Characters album. Bill Connors, there's no actual guitar strumming on them. Even Ralph Towner, there's no strumming in the traditional sense, which is a way to kind of make it sound not only fuller, but also get a rhythm cycle going. So it's interesting that these solo guitar albums don't do that. It makes the job a lot harder, actually. I got a couple that another one, this came out a little bit later. August 81 this was recorded in. And I'm very upset because this is one I wish... Well, I have some vinyl I can't find, and this is one of them. Thankfully, I bought it on CD, and it's probably better because it's a quiet album. It's playing in the background now. After the Terry Riley was over, James Newton Axum. Not only do I have this on vinyl, and I'm afraid that I left it in my old house, which is very unusual because I thought I had all my ECM vinyl, but I can't find it, and I was looking for it. I definitely wouldn't have gotten rid of it just because I bought the CD. But I bought this album 3 times. I bought the original vinyl for myself on ECM. All flutes. I bought it as a present. I had this friend, quite a few years younger than me, that I met that was a high school student. And I was in my early 20s at the time, I guess. And she was a flute player. And right about the time this album came out, too, it was in the very early 80s. And I said, and I went and I bought her a copy on vinyl of this album. I already had it in my possession before the CD era. And I said, here's something I bet you've never heard. Not only is it only solo flute, but it's overdubbed, so there's multiple flutes going on. But there's also alto and bass flutes. Now, she was totally unaware, as most young people would be, even though she was playing in orchestra in school. She was the only flute that she was aware of, because at the time there wasn't a big awareness of world music and wooden flutes and that kind of thing, was the silver, metallic, traditional classical flute that orchestras use. So when she saw this flute, alto and bass flute, she said, "I didn't even know alto and bass flutes existed." This is a great one. A lot of quiet stuff going on, but overdubs, multiple flute parts going on, but a lot of depth because James Newton is playing bass flutes and the alto flutes in addition to the regular metallic flutes. And doesn't even play like wooden flutes and all that, which is a whole nother sound. But this is one that I really appreciated as well. And again, because I love flute, but I don't have a whole hell of a lot of solo flute albums. I don't think that there are a lot of solo flute albums. But again, it was another one that you have to listen to and can change your perception of how to listen to music, I think. And I don't know where my vinyl is. If anybody knows, let me know. And another one that did this that I got was Ralph Towner's Diary. And here's the other ECM, the only other ECM album that I know I have that I haven't been able to find. This I'm sure got lost somewhere because I've looked all over for it here. And I don't know how a couple could have slipped away from me of my ECMs. I know I left others in my basement at home, but they were all pretty much rock-oriented things. No ECMs would have been down in my basement. I don't know where these albums are. But Diary was, I think it was actually his first solo album in terms of not having any other musicians on it. It was the first time Ralph overdubbed, so he plays 12 strings, classic guitars, piano, and gongs. Most of the overdubbing involves having a guitar and a piano going at the same time. So this was another interesting listen for me. Now, Ralph's done a lot of solo albums, especially in recent years, especially since the 80s. But most of them have been live, either live in front of an audience, like solo concert. So I don't really include that in here because this is a solo concert for classical guitars. Not an overdubbed project, really. And Blue Sun, which is probably my favorite album by him, but this came out later. This was recorded in December 82. Didn't come out till 83. So I was already heavily into the solo concept. Probably my favorite Ralph Towner in general. But, and he plays on Blue Sun, he does something I wish he would do again, and that's a lot of overdubs. He plays horns on here. He plays some hand percussion, in addition to his 12-string and classical acoustic guitars, piano, synthesizers, French horn, and cornet, which you rarely hear him play. So there's a lot. It's busy at times. There's a lot going on. But again, still doesn't sound like a band. Intentionally doesn't sound like a band. So I didn't intend, once again, to go this long. But the coffee helped me a bit, I'm thinking now. And I just wanted to kind of show things that were very influential in getting me to appreciate other types of music than what I listened to for my first 17 or 18 years on the planet. And those are the albums that pretty much did it for me and played a big part. There's many, many, many later on that came that were these solo overdubbed things. But these were the early groundbreaking works for me, and the ones that really forced me to, how do I listen to this? Which is not work that a lot of people are willing to put in. The people in the VC, yes, they will put in that kind of work. That's why they're music fans. But for most people, if they can't figure out how to listen to something, or it sounds empty to them, or doesn't sound like a group, so I don't like it, they drop it. They don't give it, another chance. And that's why these records don't sell incredibly well. So I'm here for an hour and didn't mean to. But that's my thing. My first coffee video. I had to do a video tonight because I said the first time I make a cup of coffee here in my home, and the first time I've ever done it in any home, actually, I'm going to film a video that night, and I did. So here it is. There's only a little bit left. And cheers, guys. I hope you're all sitting at home and partaking in coffee with me. And I'll be back probably a lot sooner than you want me to be. Hope everyone's doing well. if you want to answer this video with your own kind of influential type of things, or things that got you to change your perception on music, great. That's all the better. Hope everybody's doing well, and I'll sign off for now. Good night.